All right. Welcome to What's Real with Adrien. This is my live stream that I do every Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. So I'm really honored that you're here, and I appreciate your time very, very much. This week we're going to be talking about a very powerful subject because I think you'll see it reaches far and wide, you might say. Even though it's going to sound kind of philosophical at first, especially this whole concept of losing sight of your ideal for an idea. That's the title of this talk. And that concept can sound kind of highfalutin, you might say. But I think you'll see that as we dive into it, it's very real and we experience it in our everyday life all the time. So before we actually get talking about, losing sight of our ideal for an idea, I want to ask you that if you enjoy these videos, to please click the subscribe button. Hit that little bell icon that lets you know whenever I release a new video. And I'm on the verge of releasing a whole bunch of new videos that I'm very excited about. So click that subscribe button. And also please click the like button for the video. Leave a comment. All these things really help serve my cause. Help me get my message out. And of course, I greatly appreciate it. So now, into the conversation of losing sight of our ideal for an idea. Now, this is a big subject, and I don't want to get bogged down in too much detail, but in order to understand some of the most important elements of this, some of the places where it really hits home, we kind of got to go deep. We kind of got to look at the big picture, you might say, right? I got to live up to my statement that I always like to say, which is I try to take this conversation a little bit deeper. Our time here is all about that. And in order to do that, we're going to have to take some time here to think about an ideal. Most ideals, meaning this concept of pursuing something in its ideal form, right, is something that's very unique to human beings. First of all, I think it's beautiful that we have such an impulse within us to do this. And it's also something that actually happens relatively early in our lives. If we think of ourselves as living on average, 70 to 80 years, this part of our life usually happens in our teens to mid-20s, really. This is the time that we start to really think about what's life all about. What is it? Where's my place in life? What do I care about the most? Where do I stand on certain issues? And a lot of this has to do with our ideals. In other words, we look at these situations and we say, this is the ideal way it should be, so to speak, right? Now, I'm going to talk about many different things that we do this with because I don't want to dial in on just one because I want you to see how universal this is in your life. But the inspiration for this talk, why I'm actually sharing this conversation with you right now, came from a conversation I had with someone very close to me in regards to this whole movement going on in our country and spreading around the world, this whole Black Lives Matter movement. So it was kind of a political orientation. And when we think about that, that's certainly something that as we're approaching the age of voting and we're leaving home and going into the real world, we start thinking about our society, our civilization, our government, and all these sorts of things. And we start to form ideals, or I should say actually, ideas about these ideals. A lot of the ideals, as we're going to discover here today, are actually much more similar than we typically think of. But it's the way that we go about formulating our ideas of how we should reach these ideals that we find there's some differing. Now, this is true, as I said, in politics. It's also true in marriage. It's another example I want to use. In our relationships. Now, I'm going to use marriage. I'm going to tell a personal story, but it can be friendship, right? Relationships, period. There's a certain ideal that we carry about these things. And then the last thing that I want to talk about is our spiritual pursuits, and that we have an ideal goal in mind, so to speak, when it comes to our spiritual pursuits. Wherever our personal beliefs and all that kind of stuff lie, there's still some sort of ideal that we're reaching towards. And I'm going to say this is very good. This is a wonderful impulse we have as a human being. It's this inner drive to be better, sort of, right? To evolve, to reach for something beyond what we see in front of us right now. And this impulse is, like I said, beautiful and powerful. And getting ourselves to understanding how to get to that ideal, we start to formulate ideas, as I said. And most of this happens, again, in our teens and early 20s. We start looking and thinking and seeing, trying things on, you might say. A lot of this probably has to do with where we came from, right? There's going to be a lot of influence from that, I'm sure, what we're exposed to. But because of the nature of life, like the rhythm of life, usually around our mid-20s, we kind of wrap this part up. And that's because, life gets busy, right? We actually form relationships, we get married, we have kids, we start a career. And all these things take a great deal of our time, our attention, and our efforts, right? And so what we tend to do is we fall back on the ideas that we formulated in the early parts of our life. Now, there's nothing wrong with this. This is part of what, it's a necessity. I hope you can kind of see that, right? I mean, this is kind of just what we need to do at a certain point in our life. It's like, okay, this is what I believe, right? This is my idea of how this ideal should be approached or accomplished, right? The issue becomes when we let the idea overpower the ideal. I was talking to a friend about this very subject. I was telling him about how I was going to do this talk, and he reminded me of a very famous quote that I think summarizes in a succinct way a lot of what I'm trying to share today. So I'm going to say it. I can't imagine you haven't heard it. It's the quote that says, "No man steps into a river twice, the same river twice, because the man is not the same and the river is not the same." When we use our ideas as a solid ground to stand on, as a way to approach our ideals, we'll find they fall short. And we're going to get into this in a decent amount of detail, I think, as we go on here. But I want to make that statement now because it's really, if you think about the ideal, I want you to imagine it like a direction. It's like, you realize I need to head in this direction to accomplish this thing, whether it's the politics, right, or the social, concerns, the marriage, the spiritual pursuit. There's a direction you want to head. Now, it's very general in a certain way. Now, we need to come up with and create ideas on how to approach it, but if we attach ourselves too deeply into these ideas, we'll find that eventually they don't fit anymore because you can't step into the same river twice, right? Because you're not the same and the river's not the same. You're changing, life is changing, right? So in order to honor that reality, we need to be in some sort of a fluid motion with our ideas. We need to realize that the ideas that we set for ourselves when we were 18, 20, 22 may not fit the situation that we're in now. I'm going to share, I think, one of the simplest ways that can help you understand this in a very clear way. I'm going to share the concept of marriage, right? We have an ideal for marriage. The ideal of marriage is that, there's going to be a union. I'm going to share my life with this person, and we're going to have a connection like no other. This is the basic ideal of marriage, right? We're going to create a family, and we're going to share our lives and feel united in a very real way. Well, in my own personal life, I can tell you, I had this ideal for sure. And there were plenty of ideas that came along with that. A lot of them, actually, I wasn't even aware of until I found myself deep in marriage. One of the first times that I really had to face this fact, and it actually happened over a long span of time, but was when I realized that I had an idea that a very important part of marriage was the physical affection. Was the fact that, I was very physically attracted to my wife, and that was a very important and pivotal part of our relationship, right? It was one of the only things we shared as opposed to anyone else. I remember saying that to her and myself a lot. Well, that worked great for the first few years of our life, of our relationship and our marriage. But as everyone knows, or maybe you don't. If you don't, I'm telling you right now, this is kind of how it goes. This is the natural rhythm to marriage, right? Once we had a child, that shifted. Our priorities shifted. Our whole life shifted, right? And certainly the way that we went about physical affection shifted too. Now, I was very attached to this idea of how physical affection should be, and that I needed it in my marriage. It took me a long time to realize that I was placing this idea over the ideal of being united and sharing a life with my wife. So much so that it really began to interfere with our marriage, with this ideal. So much so that there were times that I wasn't sure I wanted to be in the marriage anymore because of this one idea. There was so many other things in our marriage that were perfect, that were ideal, you could say, right? But I had this idea that it had to be this way. I'm happy to report that I overcame this attachment to this idea, and the more that I did that, the more the whole issue, if you want to call it that, worked itself out, and our marriage found a whole nother rhythm. Here's the reality, right? 3 years into our marriage, stepping into the river of our marriage at that point, I was not the same. My wife was not the same. Life was not the same. But a certain part of me was stuck in an old part. Does that make any sense? And because of that, I was letting my idea of how it should be interfere with the actual reality of my marriage and what mattered to me the most. The reason that I had this idea, as I already kind of hinted, is I was having a conversation with someone I care very deeply about. And they were expressing how they were having a great deal of anguish, if you will, or struggling with the fact that they cared so much about this issue of Black Lives Matter, right? And a larger picture than just that, of course. And this was not something new to this person. It wasn't like they just kind of hopped on this bandwagon. This was something that was dear to their heart, Black issues and equality, all of their life. And as this has erupted in our society right now, and in our country, especially the United States, it's caused a lot of controversy, a lot of conversation, a lot of confrontation. I think I already said that, right? They were finding that this was starting to really affect some very close blood relationships in their life. So much so that there was a division, a pretty strong division. And we were talking about this. And it was in this conversation that I realized that this was what was going on. That this person was placing their idea of the ideal over the actual ideal. The way I voiced it to them in the conversation was I said, look, I know that you care deeply about this. This is an important issue to you. And it's all about, if you think about, I'm going to back up here just a minute. If you think about why we care about ideals, it's because we care. Right? Because we have actually a more basic ideal of wanting to be the best human being we can. I really truly believe that everybody, or almost everybody, there's always an exception to everything, but almost everybody carries this impetus inside. This belief or this desire to be the best person they can be. All the rest of the ideals kind of stem from this one. Because if you don't have that one, then you kind of don't care about anything else in a way, right? It's like, whatever. Do what I can do for me, and that sort of concept, right? It's only because you want to be the best you can be that you care about issues such as this. I said to them that, look, if you can't come to some sort of understanding, if you can't come to some sort of meeting of the minds and of the heart with these people that you care deeply about, I mean, look, we all know that blood relationships can carry lots of baggage, right? Because they have lots of history. But at the same time, different than a stranger even, right? But at the same time, you have an innate bond, a deep love for one another. And I know these people very well, and I know that they do have this. And if you can't work out this issue with this person that you love, what hope is there for the rest of the world? What hope is there for us coming to some sort of place of unity in our society if you can't do it with your relation, with this person that you deeply care about, that you share tons of history with? They admitted, not much. This is when you can see, by the way. Because the ideal of wanting to be the best person you can be can't all of a sudden become an issue with the person you care about the most or one of the people you care about the most. There's a breakdown there. There's a breakdown that all of a sudden this idea of how we should go about this ideal overpowers it. And all of a sudden the ideal loses. Because the ideal is to be the best human being we can be. Let's talk about that for a minute too. The person who gave me that quote, that reminded me of the quote, also was talking to me about this, and I loved it, and I want to share it. So often, especially in political things, but even in marriage, what's happening isn't so much a difference of the ideal, actually, but about the how to go about it. Right? So maybe in this issue, you could summarize this in a very simplistic way in saying that one person is really focused on liberty, and the other person is really focused on equality. Now, everybody believes in liberty, and everybody believes in equality. I don't think there's a rare person again here that you're going to find that doesn't believe in these two notions, right? In these two ideals. But what ends up happening is we spend too much time, or I don't even want to say that, because of course ideas are important. I make sure I'm stating that. It's not like we're not going to have any ideas, right? We need to come up with ideas on how to approach the ideal. We just have to make sure that they aren't breaking down, right? That they aren't interfering with this initial ideal, one of which being, I want to be the best human being I can be. Right? So if you're really focusing on liberty, you might have a different idea of how to go about it than if the person that's focusing on equality. It's not so much that they don't share the same ideal at all. It's just that one's looking at one thing a little stronger, a little more than the other person is looking at the other thing. I think that's a very useful thing. This happens in marriage too, right? Like, I was thinking about my physical needs, you might want to say, as a man, right? Or something like that. And my wife was thinking about the needs of the family and what was going on and taking care of we both cared about the marriage, but I was focusing on one part and she was focusing on another. Right? And maybe a better way, I don't think I expressed that very well. It was probably that I was focusing more on my wife and I's relationship, and my wife was focusing more on the child in our relationship. Does that make any sense? Now, they both matter. They're both very important. But if we focus too much on one way, we're going to come up with very different ideas. If we forget the fact that we share the same ideals, we're not going to be able to come to some sort of place of unity. Again, without that, what hope is there? In these challenging times, it's very important to take a deep breath and remember that we share something. And actually, we share far more than we disagree on. And when we're having conversations that are very important, that need to be had, it behooves us greatly to remember that fact, to take a moment to honor that fact. We're going to get into this near the end. I'm going to share with you my basic rule of thumb, you might say, on how to gauge if you're letting the idea overpower the ideal. I'm going to get to that in a second. I want to touch base on, so now we've talked about politics a bit, right? We've talked about relationships a bit, how you could see how if you overemphasize the ideas, you can really sabotage the ideal. This happens in our spiritual pursuits too. And I really want to take a time to talk. Really want to take a moment to talk about this because I don't think a lot of us are very aware of this, and it's incredibly important. I'm always talking about the trilogy, right? Freedom, peace, and joy. And I do this as an ideal, as setting forth an ideal, right? It's a direction again. If we get an idea too strongly in our minds about what freedom, what peace, and what joy really means, we're going to lose our ability to actually experience it. And that's because, again, an ideal is a living, breathing thing. It's a direction. It's not a destination. Because the river's always moving. You're always changing. So what you think is true at one moment, like my marriage, right? 10 years later is totally different. I shouldn't say totally different, right? That's not accurate. We want to be accurate as we can. But it's very different. I've been married 22 years now. It's very different from where it was 10 years ago. This constant evolution, shifting. I always say life is a becoming, right? So if you have this concept of what freedom, joy, and peace is, an idea of it, it's gonna interfere with your actual experiencing of it. And how this usually happens in the spiritual realm is you get a taste of it. Maybe you start a new spiritual practice. Maybe you became a born-again Christian, right? And all of a sudden, you taste this peace, this freedom, and this joy. And what a human being does typically when they have this experience is they equate whatever they were doing at the moment that they have this experience as the way to get to freedom, joy, and peace, right? It becomes an idea in the mind. Now, what typically happens is we try to repeat the process, right? Whether it was we were praying or we were sitting in a certain position or we were in the certain location or whatever the scenario is, we try to repeat it so we can get a taste of that freedom, peace, and joy. What usually happens is we'll get a little bit of a taste of it again. Or sometimes we won't be able to reproduce it at all. But a lot of times what happens is we get a small taste of it again. And then we do it again. And then we get it. It starts to diminish. Every time we try to repeat the same thing, we start feeling it. It starts to disappear in a real way, in an authentic way. And if we don't let go of the idea of what peace and joy and freedom is, then we'll end up finding ourselves in a very habitual way of approaching it, right? Whether it's the showing up to church and going through the motions or sitting down to, for the meditation and just wandering off in thought the whole entire time, right? These are two common, probably, examples of how we just have if we get attached to the idea of how to achieve these things, we will interfere with the actual experiencing of it. Why? Because the river's moving. You're not the same. Life is not the same. I want to take a minute to acknowledge that what I'm trying to share with you is not easy. To stay this open, to stay this flexible, takes effort. It does, especially at first. Because here's one of the things that I want to share with you. One of the greatest ideals you can carry with you is the one that I already talked about, right? To be the best person you can be. But it's also to remain open. When we attach to ideas, it's a way of closing down, actually. Now, again, I'm not disparaging ideas. We need them. We formulate them. We work with them. But we could learn a lot from the scientific method in that way, right? We have to always be willing to revisit it authentically. And one of the ways that you're going to be able to gauge whether you're doing this or not is to check in with your heart. Are you feeling open? Or are you feeling closed? Are you spending lots and lots of time in anger? Or are you spending a decent amount of time in, what's the word I want to use? Questioning, right? Inquiry, that's a great word. Like really looking inside of yourself. Not so concerned about the other person as much as yourself. Because if you don't do this, you're going to interfere with your ideal, whichever one it is, whether it's the marriage, the politics, or the spirituality. In order to actually honor the fact that you can't step into the river twice, you need to take the time to check within yourself and see, am I open? Now, none of us are perfectly open. It's not about that, right? But if you can't talk to your blood relative, you probably need to work in this area because you love them. If you're thinking about ending your marriage with a person that you adore, that fits almost every single part of your ideal, except this one idea that I had in my head, I probably, and thankfully I did, reflect inside to find what was amiss. Where was I falling short on my ideal? What idea was a little off? I hope this makes sense and I hope that you can sense how incredibly important this is. It's important for the ideal, whichever one you're holding and focusing on right now. If you don't actually prioritize, you could say it's a hierarchy in that way, right? The foundation of what you're trying to do should be to be the best person you can possibly be, right? And then to know that the way that you can do this, the best way to do this, is to work and learn how to be open. Again, I freely acknowledge this is a challenging thing, but without it, there's no hope. There's no hope for the cause. There's no hope for the ideal to actually be, of course, again, it's not a destination, but to approach closer to it, right? To find ourselves a little bit closer. To open your heart takes some effort, especially when you're going through something that you feel very passionate about. You know, that was another thing that my very wise friend was talking about, how anger affects the way we think. You know, it becomes it's just the way the mind, the brain actually behaves in anger. And it's a shared experience, right? It doesn't matter who's having it. We all behave the same way, and it becomes very black and white. It's that very dualistic thinking. And often, as he expressed, the phrase you might say is that the only way to win, when you're in anger, the only way to win is to have someone else lose. But this isn't true. This is just the way the brain starts to behave when it finds itself in anger. But anger, I highly doubt, is your ideal, right? Heck, it's not even the idea, probably. But when we cling to the idea, we'll find we very commonly can fall into this space of anger. Now, not all things, but I could tell you that definitely happened to me in my marriage, right? That was definitely a place I found myself. I'd get angry about things like that. And it would shut myself down in a certain way, right? It was very much, I'm right, you're wrong. You're not seeing my side of things, right? I don't think it's too hard to see the end to that sort of journey, right? I mean, if that's the way we're gonna walk the whole time, it's not hard to see where we'll end up, which is a divided place. And I don't think that upholds or is part of any of the ideals that we all hold dear. To work on opening your heart takes a great deal of courage. It takes a great deal of intent too. That's why I really want to stress it, because you need to place focus there, ideally, as much as you're putting into the idea of what it is you're trying to do. But of course, very few of us are going to be able to do that. And that's okay. It actually doesn't have to be that much. It just has to be part of it. When you're finding your spiritual pursuits feel dead and dry, it's probably because you're attached to an idea of how it should be. Shake it loose. Go deep within and find the ideal again, which is always going to be a certain amount of letting go of the idea. I'm not sure if we have any questions or anything like that. I'm not sure how much time it's been either. I feel like, actually, pretty close. I want to take a moment to express my deep love for every single person watching this right now, and my faith that we can indeed place the ideal first. That we are all sharing in this movement together. We may go about it different ways, and I don't always agree with the way that everybody's going about it. I don't either. But I hold true in my heart the belief that everybody is doing the best that they can. And that doesn't mean I excuse their behavior necessarily, but that I start from that place. That I try to listen because I believe they're doing the best they can. I have people, I can tell you right now, there's been times like in office work where I'm working with an individual on their problems, and I know that they are outright lying to me. I know it, either because of something we've said already, they've already said it around. I don't judge that person on that lie. If I were to do that, it would limit my ability to remain open. Because we all lie once in a while, right? We all fail in some way or shape or form. And if we don't allow that sort of, discrepancy, if you will, we're not going to be able to get past it, if that makes any sense. Like, if I was doing that in the office with somebody, that would kind of be the end of it. Like, look, I can't trust you. So our relationship as a coach and a client is over. That wouldn't really help that much, would it? It wouldn't help me either. I probably wouldn't have very many clients after a while. It's the same thing in all of these, whether it's the marriage, whether it's the social issues, whether it's the spiritual pursuit, right? In a spiritual pursuit, what it ends up being is you're lying to yourself. It's very common. Don't judge yourself and don't judge the other person over a certain way they're behaving or a certain thing that they said. It's only a small fraction of the person. And what happens is we focus in on that and it becomes the whole. But that's just an idea. And if we hold on to that idea, we'll lose our ideal. I want to thank you. Oh, we do have something?
I have a question.
Okay, we have a question. Oh, sorry.
If you're having trouble talking with someone and feeling angry, how can you move past that?
Well, I think I might have just hinted to it. A lot of deep breaths. A lot of deep breaths help. And that might sound silly, but it's actually very real. It's very true. It's a way of shifting your reality a little bit. When we are being reactive, we breathe very shallowly. So the moment we take the time to deep breathe, we start to shift our biochemistry, all kinds of stuff. It's very useful. It's a simple thing. But I would also say what I just said. I would kind of repeat what I just said. I would say, get in touch with what's really important with you, not just whatever it is that made you angry, right? Because that's going to be very situational. It's going to have to do with a very specific, or maybe a group. I don't mean like one specific thing, but a group of specific things, right? Ideas again. It's to take a few deep breaths, remember what's really important to you. And I don't know who asked that question. It's part of why my wife and I do that, so I don't. I love that part. I don't know who asked that question, but I know that you care deeply about being the best person you can be. Remind yourself of that. Don't beat yourself up because you're angry. That doesn't help anything, right? But remind yourself of the ideal. This is what's important. If we go back to this place over and over again, this is the practice in a way, this is how we learn how to do it, right? We return to this ideal of being open, of being the best person I can be. We start to learn how to do it. It's kind of like riding a bicycle, right? If you revisit that, you'll let go. The anger will, I don't want to say it'll disappear, of course, right? But it'll diminish a bit. Because all of a sudden you've reminded yourself of what's really important. And by doing that, you can start to try to look past whatever it is that made you angry. You have to want to, by the way, too, right? I always talk about that as a willingness thing. It's such an important element to anything, actually, but something that's challenging like that, too, right? You have to have a willingness to look past the anger that you have, and that you're probably receiving, by the way. Usually we don't get angry all on our own. It's kind of a very reciprocal sort of thing, right? I hope that answered the question a little bit. Is there another one? Okay.
Why do we get stuck on our ideas?
Why do we get stuck? I'm assuming, I think we can always hear my wife here, so why do we get stuck on our ideas? That's a big one. I really like it. There's a lot of reasons. Some of them are very natural, meaning it's the way our brain works, right? It's a way of simplifying things. It's there's another thing my friend was sharing with me that I'm starting to read the book he was suggesting to check out to understand this a little deeper. The way the brain works, it's always trying to conserve energy. It actually takes a great deal of energy to do deep cognitive thinking, right? So it's always kind of looking for ways to conserve energy. And one of the ways it does that is it will take things, ideas, you might say, and habitualize them, like throw it into the part of the brain that just stores it away and can retrieve it quickly. It's not going through the deep thinking process that we might have done when we were 18, 20, 22, 24, right? So we fall back on that idea. Does that make any sense? So this is like a sort of a biological way, you might say, of why we do this. Like the brain's always working to do that in a way. It's trying to conserve energy, right? A more philosophical or spiritual, maybe I should say, reason is it's actually a incredibly deep-rooted reality to being a human being, which is even the language with which I'm talking to you right now is an idea. It's a symbol, right? It's not the real thing. Like I always say, if I say the word apple, it's not really an apple. You can't eat it, right? So the moment we do something like that, which is unavoidable, in a certain way, it's unavoidable, we're separating ourselves, we're distancing ourselves from reality. So the idea, because an idea is something from the past. And no matter how fast you think, it's always trailing behind this moment right now. This kind of comes back to you can't step into the same river twice. This reality too, this is part of why it's so important to make this a practice, if you will, to remind yourself that you're never when you're thinking, you're never dealing with reality. You're dealing with your thoughts of reality. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But it is an idea. And it's very easy to become attached to these ideas because we start to believe they are the reality. Just like apple. I'm writing about this right now for my blog, and I quoted Krishnamurti. I don't know if you know who that is, but he's a pretty famous spiritual teacher, Indian spiritual teacher who spent a lot of time in the States. And he said that once you teach a child the name of a bird, they never see that bird again. Something like that. I'm not sure I said it exactly right. But it's the point is, they store it away. It becomes a thought now. Oh, bird. And they stop taking the time to really just be with the bird like a child does. Right? I hope this isn't an over-explanation, but this is the depth of... Now we are going deep in this conversation, right? This is how deeply rooted ideas are. And so it's easy to understand, by the way. So why cut yourself some slack. I'm not trying to make anybody feel bad by getting attached to ideas. I'm just trying to make you aware of the fact that we do it, and it gets in the way of our ideals, which are, in a certain way, I want to say more important, but they're the direction. And we get lost on our direction if we pay attention to the idea too much. No matter what the idea is, the ideal, or reality, I should say reality, has shifted. The ideal doesn't really change. It's that we do, right? That life does. I hope that answered it. Anybody else? This is so great, though. There's been quite a few live streams. I haven't had any questions, so I'm really glad that you did that. You actually just made my day. It's such an honor to spend this time with you guys. It really is. It's become my favorite part of the week. I have to say it. As always, I thank you for your time. It's precious.